that got a letter in his pocket. Go on, down to the city of Damascus. Oh, Lord, sometimes God stop you with a gun muzzle out. Sometimes God stop you with the point of a knife.
Well, I'm glad that you can join us on this exposure to Gullah history, which is African American history, and the importance it has had in the history of Africans, Europeans, as well as the American Indians. What I'm going to present in the lecture part of this presentation is an overview of the information that covers maybe from 10,000 to 15,000 years. So a lot of things have been concentrated down to a smaller form, large concepts, so I can convey them to you. Now, the history is very important because it helps not only African people, black people, and white people, and red people. History helps a person find out where they are. History helps a person to define their purpose and goal in life. By holistically studying African history, by studying the history itself, it makes you intelligent, it makes you healthy, and it makes you spiritual. That's what history does when it's studied from an African perspective, as contrasting to a European perspective. When you study history, all you're studying is dates, and times, and events of people. But when African history is studied from an Afrocentric perspective, it helps a person become more intelligent, more healthy, and more spiritual. That's the purpose of history, to help move a person, not to help accumulate a whole lot of dates and events and adventures of people as you're commonly taught in European history concepts. Now then, the African perspective may be a little difficult for some people to understand because we're used to hearing European history, European African history, European history, but what we're going to approach is a way of looking at history through the eyes of someone who has been in history a long time. African people have been the creators of the wheel and the creators of science. So their perspective on history has a long trail of years behind it, so it's more moving and more impacting. So that's what you will feel when the presentation is given to you, an impact from it. It's a choice that you really have to make. Do you want to talk to the person who invented the wheel, or do you want to talk to the person who fixed the wheel? Do you want to talk to the person who invented mathematics, or you want to talk to the person who can add and subtract? Do you want to talk to the people who own history, the African people, or do you want to talk to the people who copy history, the Europeans? All historical data verifies that Africa is the genius of civilization. By the word genius, I mean the start, the beginning. It is the genesis of civilization. So when you're talking from an African historical perspective, it's more impacting, and you may feel a more emotional moved by the words that I say in the formal presentation. That's what I want you to be aware of. It's more than just knowing dates. It's knowing a spiritual understanding of a people, how they think and how they are put together. Because African people move to uplift the planet, whereas European history, if you view it, it moves to uplift certain individuals. That's what happened when America was so-called discovered. A certain aristocratic group of people who were businessmen made a move to come across the Atlantic Ocean to uplift themselves economically. Not to uplift red people, black people, yellow people, but to just uplift themselves. And that is the contrast between African history and European history. Our history tends to move people spiritually, intellectually, and health-wise, whereas European history just moves individuals closer to their economic dreams or whatever they are, which they call manifest destiny, the ordained capacity to control other people. So we're going to move away from that, and you'll have a lot of friction moving inside yourself that you're not familiar with when you hear this formal presentation on Gullah history. However, the Gullah people are very important in African history and European history because they were the first people to come over here in contemporary times to initiate an Afrocentric perspective, an Afrocentric way of existing. The Gullah people started communities in Alabama, Tennessee, Florida, and in Canada that were independent, manufactured their own goods, had a solid trade system where the person who went to purchase some goods from a store, for instance, would leave the money and pick up the goods, and the man who owned the store and the person who purchased the goods would never see each other. That's called a silent trade system. And these kind of ways of thinking were introduced into America, as well as the slang vocabulary, which is 90% African words. I can't go into all of it at this present time, but I'm trying to say there's a subtle move that was caused in history worldwide by the Gullah people, the West African people, coming over to America. It impacted history beyond the scope in which we're normally looking at. By the Gullah, by definition, Gul and means, is usually attributed to God or a blessing. So we have Gul, which is a blessed people. Gullah, the people blessed by God. All the words in African language is usually associated with the spiritual development of a person, of God, and of life. So therefore, the word is giving some kind of acknowledgement to God by the word Gullah. And that is associated with the West African people that came to a specific area called the Sea Islands. Those islands are in the Atlantic Ocean, starting from St. Augustine, Florida, and going up to Georgia, South Carolina, and North Carolina. And the people there were isolated after 1861, when the so-called Civil War ended in this area, which it actually ended in 1865. However, it ended in the Sea Island area in 1861. So from that day, which is called Gun Shoot Day, the Gullah people were isolated on the island because the land was given to them. And so they were isolated and concentrated in a Pacific area called the Sea Islands, and they were able to maintain more of African culture. And that's what makes them very unique. We maintained African culture, West African culture in this area more than any other area in America. And that's why they're very much studied. However, the Europeans tend to study the language and associate the language with being a dialect. This is years ago they used to call the African accent on words a Negro dialect. And so today they're kind of contributing Gullah to being some kind of West African dialect, when actually it's a West African language that uses English, just as the Negro dialect was the African language that used English. But since the Europeans had the power to define words and control words, we never go past that point. So it's very important that we look at the words differently when they're used in the presentation on Gullah history. The words not ending in Greek, which the Greeks came into Africa in 331, and then the Romans came in 201. However, we're not ending and beginning the words in Greece. Greece is a copy of African civilization. So the words that are used have a holistic definition that extend past the Greek civilization, past the ethnic groups of the Italians and French. And so the words are much larger than what they appear when I'm using them in the formal presentation. However, back to the Gullah, we're talking about the people who were able to preserve African history more so than any other group. And a lot of the history has been suppressed for political reasons, because of people that can know their history can know where they're going, and it gives them more power. So our history has been suppressed in the educational system, has been suppressed in the religious systems of beliefs such as Catholicism and Baptists. Our history is not taught in the church, it's not taught in the schools. So there's a big hunger that has to be satisfied historically by not only African people but European people, because they're damaged more so by history than anyone else, because they delete things on purpose. You understand? The question sometimes exists is, why did Africa fall, and what happened, and maybe they were weak people and all this sort of thing. What really happened was in the presentation I present how the groups fragmented and divided and became weak and migrated and traveled back and forth. And so they became rather weak. Groups that were migrating back and forth, from leaving one kingdom, going to another kingdom, leaving one dynasty, going to another dynasty, because there were multiple dynasties in Africa at one time. And so they were once under the allegiance of their elder, who was a representative of them, and then the elder began to represent the king, or whoever's in charge of the dynasty, more than the people. So the people became dissatisfied with that and began to fragment and form their own customs and cultures and languages and divide out. And that's when the Europeans came into Africa, when it was falling, when the people were divided, and Europeans coming from a divided, fragmented civilization of over 10,000 years, they were rather expert at this kind of linear way of dealing with things, dividing and conquer, dividing and conquer. That's when they happened upon Africa in that state, and that's why they were able to capitalize on it and helped bring Africa further down. The other problem that contributes to the downfall of Africa is that the knowledge and technology of Africa was presented to the Europeans without preparing the Europeans to receive it. What we've run into is that our ancestors, instead of giving a teaching plan of how to teach the Europeans, they should have done a treatment plan on how to treat the Europeans. Because what was recognizable was the illness that's under white racism, the illness that's under white supremacy, the illness that's under the need for slavery. We have a group of Europeans, a civilization, the French, the Dutch, the Romans, the Portuguese, the Spanish, who have a need for white supremacy, white racism, and slavery. And that need is the primary illness that should have been treated. So what we should have done historically is devise a treatment plan for the Europeans instead of a teaching plan. And that's what we didn't assess when the Europeans came into Africa. So all of this is part of the movement, of holistic movement of history, in which we're going to explore in the formal part of the presentation. I want you to know that a lot of the things are undone jobs of our ancestors, which has to be done today by those who are able to get a lot of information, a lot of spiritual movement, a lot of intelligence and help from our ancestors. We have to kind of move away from the Europeans and look at our history from our eyes and not their eyes. Understand that nothing has really been invented by the Europeans. The electrical concepts came out of Africa, the airplane came out of Africa, the match came out of Africa. All these things came out of the genius of Africa. And the Europeans have not solved these problems. They did not create these problems. We can't look for them to get rid of problems that they know nothing about. They haven't gotten rid of plagues in 1 AD, 86 AD, 77 AD, 120 AD. The plagues are still part of them. Syphilis, gonorrhea, typhoid, tuberculosis, smallpox. These are things that destroyed over 90% of European civilization, and we cannot expect the Europeans to get rid of the modern plagues today of gonorrhea, syphilis, and AIDS. They have not gotten rid of plagues, and they have not been able to move the civilization of the world forward. That is the job of African people. So with that, I would like to present the formal presentation of African Holistic Health. As you already know, my name is Llaila Afrika. I am a historian. My background is in traditional African medicine and traditional African history, as well as into the treatment of African people. So I would like you to welcome this information given to us by ancestors into your heart, into your mind, into your spirituality, and into your intelligence. Yes, I am Llaila Afrika. My name means, Llaila means light of the heaven and earth, and Afrika is an Egyptian word that means land of the Kappa. So my name, when you combine it, means man from the land of Kappa, who is the light of the earth, Llaila Afrika. What I'm going to talk to you about is briefly an overview of Gullah history as it relates to the American Indians, as it relates to Europeans, as it relates to the Africans. We have a collage of people that got together in the 14th and 15th and 16th century for some reason, and the reasons have been distorted and they're kind of unclear if you look at it just from one perspective. Say if you look at it from a European perspective. So what we're trying to do now is to look at it from a humanistic perspective as to what really went on when these groups of people got together. Now what I'm referring to is history. When you look at the word and how it's put together and broke down, it really means his story. History means European, which also means the white story of what happened. So we've been constantly looking at the events and adventures of people and calling it his story because it actually has been his story. But today what we're going to look at is the human aspect of this story to find out what really went on when these people came together. Now, one of the factors involved in why the Europeans came to Africa is because of the technology that was in Africa. the technology that built the pyramids of Giza, the technology that invented the wheel, the fire stick, which is commonly called the match, the technology of boiling water. All of these aspects caused the European to want to come to Africa, the technology alone. But the technology is held in something called melanin. Melanin is produced by a gland called the pineal gland, which comes from the word pine, and it sits in the center of the brain. And this is where the Africans are distinguishingly different from the Europeans, because of that pineal gland, which produces this substance called melanin. Melanin is black. And this substance is a polymer. Without getting into too many scientific terms, what this substance does is store memory. It creates electromagnetic force. It speeds up the impulse of nerves. It causes the African to be highly intelligent, highly spiritual. It also speeds up nerve impulse. It also causes the African and black people all over the world to absorb more color in their eyes, to hear a fuller range of color, also to be more protected from ultraviolet rays of light, which is converted into another form of energy in the body. This melanin is composed of amino acids of tyrosine, methionine, and tryptophan, which is centered around a sulfur and transmitted by a neurotransmitter called zinc, which you call a metal. In any case, without being too scientific, this is what distinguishes the African from all other people on this planet. This is what makes the African very intelligent, very spiritual, and one of the founders of civilization and culture in the world today, the melanin factor. Now, when we get into African history, we sometimes leave out some important things that occurred. By just ending our history in America and beginning in America, we only have a partial idea of what actually happened. We start off with people like Harriet Tubman. Now, Harriet Tubman was one of the people that founded the Underground Railroad, as it was called. It was actually a liberation movement sponsored by black people, which the Europeans participated in. What I mean by that is that a man by the name of Toussaint Louverture down in Haiti sent up over 200 black troops to help this lady, Harriet Tubman, free imprisoned black people called slaves. They would go to plantations and liberate the slaves and bring them back down into the South. She was from Massachusetts, sent down by the governor, and she helped set up the first hospital, black hospital here in South Carolina, and also the first black bakery. She did some very important things. She also read the Emancipation Proclamation when it came out, which did not free the slaves historically at all. The Emancipation Proclamation, which was issued by Abraham Lincoln, said that those states that joined the Union still could retain slaves. That meant that they still could own slaves. So the Emancipation Proclamation, by definition, didn't free anyone. In fact, President Lincoln of the United States didn't free anyone. The 13th Amendment freed the slaves, but that wasn't passed until 8 months after Lincoln died. So historically, this business about Lincoln freeing the slave is a bit of fiction and fable produced by Europeans. But Harriet Tubman, along with Toussaint Louverture, along with soldiers, Afro-American soldiers in America, went up north and in the South and freed slaves. But we can't just leave our history at Harriet Tubman or with George Washington Carver or with Frederick Douglass. We have to go further, get to our true roots as of the people. Where did we come from in Africa? What was the region that we came from? What caused the Europeans to be attracted to that particular region that we came from? We were brought over here to the United States of America on the East Coast. We came from the West Coast of Africa, the majority of us, and were shipped directly over here to the East Coast of America because of things that the East Coast of America and the West Coast of Africa have in common. So we're going to go look at our true roots. As you can see from this picture, these ladies here have their hair wrapped in a gaily. That is an African hair garb. It's wrapped in a particular fashion that distinguished one lady from another, one tribe from another, one family group from another. So they had a particular way that they wrapped their hair with a gaily. Now, in those wrappings is a lot of history. A lot of history as reflected in the pyramids, the pyramid text, the coffin text. African people were not an oral people, as we've been commonly told. That's just another fact and fiction of the Europeans. We were a literary people. We wrote. We wrote on coffins. We wrote on walls. We wrote on floors. We wrote on jewelry. We wrote on jars. We wrote on instruments. We wrote a lot. We are literary people. What caused the Europeans to think that we were orals? Because of our age span, as recorded by John Cock and many explorers that came to Africa, they wrote that Africans lived to be 150 to 200 years old. So that caused the Europeans to think that we had an oral tradition, because a 20-year-old man could talk to his father who was 40, could talk to his grandfather who was 60, could talk to his great-grandfather who was 80, could talk to his great-great-grandfather who was 100. So he had a lot of history he could get orally, going over to 150-year-old to 250-year-old ancestor. So it appeared like an oral history to the Europeans because their lifespan was less than 40 years of age. So they had no oral history, nor did they have literary history. What they had was copied from Africans. Literature was copied from Africa. Theater, writing, the symbolism, as you can see, was copied from Africa. This man here is commonly called Adolf Hitler. He copied that symbolism of using this bird on his head from an African over here, St. Maurice. And that was copied from Egypt. Horus, the wings of Horus, which is part of the medical symbol today. Those symbols come from Africa, as does this running cross, which was first used by the Africans in recorded history. And then the Africans taught it to the American Indians. That's in 800 BC. I'm talking about not the contemporary Afro-Americans that came to America in the slave trade. I'm talking about our ancestors that came to America in 800 BC before Columbus. These symbols, the symbol that Hitler has on his head as well as his running cross, are African symbols. And we're going to reveal that as we go on. Now, what I was talking about earlier was the area which the Africans came from that came to America. Now, we know that the institution of slavery, better known as a business enterprise, it was started because of business and because of survival. Now, this institution, the slaves were mixed in Africa, put on boats, took them across the Atlantic Ocean on the northeast equatorial current, down to South America, down to the Gulf of Mexico, around Alabama, around Florida, on up the coast of Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina. And then the boat would take us right back over to the continent of Africa. Now, that was a slave run, but it lasted about 6 months, mind you. And during that 6-month journey, they were laid side by side in tiers and decks, and could not breathe properly, chained together, had to sleep on urine and sleep cold at night, and the water they was given usually had worms and parasites in it. And many people would rebel, and there were quite a few rebellious people, as the Europeans called them. They went on ships and attacked other ships, black men that owned ships, attacking white man's ships to free their brothers and sisters. We came from an urban area. We were city dwellers. That's where the technology was. The Europeans needed something to build America, and they discovered that it was in Africa. There was this group of people called the Gullah people, or from an ethnic group, really, which is the Gullah group. That's an ethnic name. Just as you have ethnic groups like the Italians, the French, they were ethnic groups in Africa, the Gullah. And then there's the Kisi people, K-I-S-S-I, which is commonly called Geechee when you get it over to the word as it comes over to America. Then you have the Creole people, K-R-I-O, which is called Creole. So you have the Creole, the Geechee, and the Gullah, which are all ethnic groups, just as the Fulani are ethnic groups. Now, they came from a West African area, the area of Africa where the heritage was rich, where there was blooming in industry, where there were great walled cities. This is a walled city, typical of African cities of that time. Cities housing at least to 100,000 people. They used walls which separated the land, divided it into division, and each wall had inside of it what we call wards, which you call districts today. That system of districts comes from Africa. So you had various districts inside the walled city. And for instance, say Hausa would move to a walled city. Then his wife and his brother would come. So you would have one ward that was just composed of Hausa people. Another ward would be Fulani people. Then you have the Kisi people. So inside of these wards were various ethnic groups inside these walled cities. This is one of the walled cities. These walls were not very small. Now the walls were structured according to what we call a tetragrammatic understanding of life. The walls were structured to explain the laws of nature, the laws of God, and the laws of man. It wasn't haphazardly done. It's based around that thing I showed you in the beginning called melanin, the melanin factor. Melanin being the center. Then you have these ventricles here, which are breathing areas. You have ventricles in your brain, and allegedly the soul and spirit in these ventricle areas, which they call them municipalities. This man called Paul called them municipalities of the spirit and soul. So this structure of the walled city reflects the melanin principle. It also reflects the ventricles of the brain. This reflects the development of the human being in the spiritual form, in the physical form, and in the human kingdom, as well as in the psychological form. So these cities were not haphazardly built, the walled cities. This is the sketch of the walls of Ife. I'm trying to give you an understanding of how large these cities were. They had a population of 100,000 men that would commute back and forth every day by horse, by wagon, by donkey caravans to their work. Some of them worked in mines, some of them worked in carpet guilds, some of them worked in glass factories. What we call today unions comes out of Africa, the concept of having unionized labor. They had guilds during that time, guilds in these cities. One of the cities, I'm trying to give you an idea that this is nothing new. The Europeans knew about it. It may be new to you. These cities were old. One of the first ones in written history was 1 AD. That was called Mandaria. Then we have another in recorded history, say in 9 AD, that's called Katisa, or Corno-Borno city. Then in 1100 we had Cassina. Then we have 1350, we have Gobir, and then around 1450 we had Zaria. This is recorded information by Europeans explorers, and this is one of the cities, how large they were. The men on horses and wagons. These cities had huge walls. Some of the walls were about 30 feet to 50 feet wide and up to 50 feet high. And at these walls they had gates where the people were entered in and out of the city. And at the gate you would pay taxes. And this is the way the city would get capital to reinvest and also keep track of the transit that was coming in and out of the city. You must realize that there were no police in the city. The whole concept of having a police state, a police going around your neighborhood and watching you is European. No other civilization in history has had police. And these cities did not have police. The laws were based on the technology of the family. The family is the foundation of African culture, and that's how everything is built, around the family. Marriages were done to protect the family, to protect the culture, to protect the civilization, so there was no need for police. The family policed itself. This is one of the other walled cities in Africa called Masina. This city was huge. You had some castles there that covered 640 acres. This is one of the Bagria. This is a sultan of Bagramia returning to the capital. And Masina, he had a donkey caravan, he had camels, he had horses, he had musicians. They all traveled back to the city. This is around 1850. These are sketches that were done during that particular time. That's why they're kind of hard to look at. These original sketches. I'm trying to give you an idea of what the Europeans actually saw, and they drew it in these sketches here. This is the idea of the gates, how huge these cities were, and the walls, the caravans that traveled back and forth. They were trade cities. A lot of trading was done in dye and fabric. They had fabric mills to make fabrics, and they were dyeing various colors. And colors were something that the Europeans did not have. Maybe around the 17th century, the Europeans started wearing some colors besides gray and brown. But before that time, Africa had all the colors, the dye of yellow, green, red, purple, orange. All of these colors came out of Africa, which caused the Europeans to want to come there and trade. This is how the Great Walls look. This is Zinder. And this is the urban heritage of West Africa. These are some of the cities. We have the city of Timbuktu up at the top, at the pyramid top of the river here. Did you see the Niger River? That's Timbuktu up at the top. Some of them may not be distinguishable to you. We have Timbuktu up here. We have Goa here. These are large cities. Timbuktu had universities, had medical schools, had doctors, professors, engineers, and all of them around here are major cities coming off the cataracts. This is called a cataract, where you have a bend in the river. And where this bend is in the river are floodplains. So the water would flood annually and go out this far, 500 miles sometimes, and deposit about 5 to 12 feet of topsoil. So this area was very fertile, very fertile. But one of the problems with Africa is that it's on an inclining plane going north, like this, an inclining plane. Starting at the center of Africa, the incline goes this way. So that is why the river of Nile flows from the south to the north because it's on an incline, whereas in the United States you have the Mississippi River and other rivers, they flow from the north to the south. But in Africa, the longest river in the world, the Nile River, flows from the south to the north because of the incline. So that caused the rich soil to be taken away from the center of Africa and deposited out around the side, around the coastline, I'm sorry. So you have these great cities all along the Niger River and the Bainu River. By the way, this word Niger here has become very distorted here in the United States because of the way it's been used. Originally, slaves that were purchased from this area were called slaves from the Niger Bend of the Niger River. However, the Europeans, unable to speak African language so well, distorted the word, and they would correct when they called the slaves Nigers because they were coming from the Niger Bend of the Niger River, and they said, we bought some slaves from the Niger Bend. These are Niger slaves. And the word just became niggers, and it became something distasteful for African Americans to hear, but actually it is an African word, and they were identifying you with a land, which is what the word African American does. It identifies you with Africa, and the word Niger was identifying us with the Niger River in Africa. Now, the cities had streets that were paved. Some of the streets up to 300 feet wide. That's about the size of the football field. Paved areas, housing areas, plantation areas where you had farming areas. Men would leave this area and go to the farm and to the guild areas where the guilds were set up for metal work, for printing, for writing guilds. And this is how the cities look with their paved highways. These are very large cities, populations of over 100,000. Remember, I told you that some of the castles themselves would cover 640 acres. And inside these castles were learning institutions, universities. But one of the things I want to show you, I'm going to go back to this other slide and show you something here. Now, when the Europeans did come to Africa, they came along the coastline here. And they would lease various, what they call outposts along the coastline. They would lease. And what they would do is trade inside of Africa. And sometimes they would give some kings of certain tribes more money and help them become wealthy. And that all along they would be building up armies and building up weapons along the coastlines. So all along the coastline the Europeans were. And then they began to attack within the interior. And that caused people that lived in Benin and other cities to move away from this area where they were being attacked, like the Kumasai and all these other areas. So they would move inward, away from this fertile area here, away from where the soil was rich and plentiful vegetation. They would move into the scarcity areas because the Europeans were waging war in this area. So they would move into scarcity areas, remembering that the Europeans come from a scarcity area itself in Europe, cold climate, scarce food production. So the Europeans had over 10,000 years of dealing in a scarcity mentality. And all of a sudden, the Africans were introduced to a scarcity mentality, and they didn't know how to deal with this. So the Europeans came to the area when Africa was declining. They did not cause Africa to fall. Africa was declining all along, simply because of the kings. Like if you had an area, say for instance, in the Gullah area of the sea coast, these are sea island areas, along the sea coast of the Atlantic Ocean, outside of Georgia, South Carolina, and North Carolina. And these people are known as Gullahs because they were isolated. And these slaves were brought directly from the coast of Africa and brought to the sea islands. So they were isolated from the Europeans because the Europeans didn't come to the sea islands because of diseases that were there, like malaria. And it was very humid there, so the Europeans couldn't breathe too well. So they would stay away from that because of the respiratory diseases were plentiful. And the Africans were raised in this area where there were savannas and marshes and knew how to do a lot of marsh farming, rice farming, which was a big crop there, and also how to deal with cotton. Cotton farming was also large in the area. So the Europeans controlled this area around here by the coast as the kingdoms were separating and breaking up, and Africa was on a decline. So someone, a member of one tribe, would select an elder to represent the tribe. And the elder was not the leader, but a representative of the tribe. And the elder would have a council of elders to help make laws, to help in discipline, to help initiate different things into the culture, to help improve in ceremonies and rituals and perform rites of passages. Those are the steps of growing and maturity for the young African men and women. And all these things were decided by the the council of the elders, and the elder himself. So the people were directly related to and responsible to the elder, and the elder was directly related to and responsible to the people. But once the tribe became a member of a kingdom, then the elder became responsible to the king. He was no longer 100% responsible to the people. So the people began to mistrust their representative, the elders, and they moved away. They moved away from the kingdoms that they didn't want to be a part of. So this migration caused the civilization to get kind of lost, to get kind of separated, and as the tribes and communities would move away, they would develop certain ceremonies that was only indicative for that community or that tribe, and that language become distinct for that tribe. So they began to be fragmented, isolated, separated, and they live in these scarcity areas, which is what the Europeans had always lived in all during their history, in isolated, fragmented areas, and the scarcity of food. So they had a great technology, a great amount of wealth on how to steal and kill and murder for the scarcity of foods and supplies that exist. So they came into Africa when the Africans were into a new era of understanding called scarcity, because they were moving away from the kingdoms and the various divisions of the kingdom coming under this dynasty and that dynasty. So the tribes began to fragment and separate. And when the Europeans came, they came with a scarcity, fragmented, linear way of thinking into something that they were totally familiar with. Separation, division, separation and division. So they capitalized on it. And they went into the coast, established outposts and fortresses, and built up armies and ammunition, and they began to attack the area around the coast. So they controlled the whole coastline of Africa eventually, and therefore imprisoned Africa. They had the whole area of the continent of Africa surrounded. This is the urban heritage, however. We did not come from the jungle. We were not desert people. We were city dwellers, teachers, professors, technology we were responsible for in the growth and development of Africa. That's what I'm trying to make clear. It wasn't for the labor that the Gullah people were brought to the sea islands. It was for the technology, things they knew how to do, things they knew how to teach, and what they were about. This is the great city of Kong, the Empire of Kong. This is a panorama view of Kong in 1888. It's not too clear, but this is one of the original etchings, drawings that the Europeans did when they came to the Kingdom of Kong. I know we've been taught that there's some gorilla named King Kong, and we've been kind of given a negative image about Kong, but Kong was a very large empire in West Africa. The Portuguese said they captured Kong in 1575, but they did not meet Queen Nzinga. Queen Nzinga, after her brother lost control of the Kong Empire, she became in charge of it in 1623, and she fought the Portuguese for well over 40 years until she died in 1663, excuse me, Queen Nzinga. And what she did was brought those fragmented groups back together, those fragmented tribes and communities. She brought them back together under one God, one aim, one purpose, and one destiny. And that was the strength. She brought all the people together, and then under one major power called the Kingdom of Kong, and fought the Europeans successfully, defeated the Portuguese. This is another city, walled city. You can see the walls over here. I don't know how clear you can see them. Walled cities, and all the major buildings were always in circular form. Circle is supposed to be a very powerful form to be in. You don't find those separations, sharp corners, and building structures until you see the European buildings. But the African buildings always was in a circular form, as were the walled cities, as I showed you before. Now, to get a good perspective on Gullah history and Gullah people, we have to start at the starting point. The starting point is the African origin of civilization, Myth or Reality by Diop. This book clearly demonstrates that Africa is the cradle of all civilizations. Documentation, carbon analysis, clearly identifies where the civilization comes from. So you don't feel lost in history. You have to know where you came from to know where you're going. And this book helps you to know where you're going. Now, as I mentioned before, the instruments, the technology is what the Gullah people were brought over to the east coast of America for. They knew about rice farming. They knew about rice hooks and rice hoes. And here's a mule boot down here. Now these instruments that were used in Africa. They brought this knowledge with them. They came from areas like Niger, as I mentioned before, the Niger River. They came from Nigeria, Cameroon, Dahomey, the Ivory Coast, Liberia, Sierra Leone. They came from Gambia. Gambia is where the first cowboys in America came from. They were brought over to the Sea Islands to show the Europeans how to herd cattle. They were experts in herdsmanship. The first cowboys in America were African people. What was going on in the Sea Islands? The Europeans were trying to get out of a predicament, economic predicament. We had been taught, unfortunately, that the Europeans in some kind of way were united. They were not united, they were fragmented. And this fragmentation shows up constantly and constantly and constantly. The Portuguese came over to the United, what is called the United States today, in order to get out of the economic slump they were in. They were trying to do something for their economic survival. So they came over to the Sea Island areas. I mentioned before, the Sea Islands are those islands in the Atlantic Ocean, start from St. Augustine, Florida, go up to Georgia, South Carolina, and North Carolina. But the main thrust of the area was St. Augustine. That was a strong point for the Portuguese. And they were trying to control a certain portion of the land in order to control the wealth. The Portuguese were. They were trying to get out of the economic condition that they were in Portugal. So they decided that one way to do that is to get some technology. And again, the technology came from this coastal area. There were the experts at rice farming, the experts at cloth dyeing, the experts at pottery and metalwork and making glass, the experts in herdsmanship. As I mentioned before, over here in Gambia is where the first cowboys came to America and showed the white men how to ride horses and herd cattle and sheep and goats better. The African cowboys didn't deal with pigs. Pigs are something very indicative of European culture. The first pigs were brought to America in 1526 by the Spanish. They brought them over to an island called Paris Island in the Sea Islands. And they started bringing pigs because that is one of the rodents that the Europeans eat. Nonetheless, the Africans learned how to process and salt. They didn't learn how. They performed salting and processing and curing of this animal called the pig, and the hog butchering and making sausages for the Europeans. Before then, the Africans were not on a diet of eating pigs and pig feet and chitterlings and all these things that the Afro-Americans think are part of their diet. The science of nutrition comes out of Africa. The science of food combining comes out of Africa. The coprolite studies, which is a science that deals with the analysis of food that's in the stomachs of the mummies in the pyramids in Africa, shows that the Africans only ate whole food, whole wheat, kush, bee pollen, sprouts. They ate a natural food diet. But nonetheless, when they were brought into the institution of slavery, they had to deal with this animal, this rodent called the pig. And they were not eating the higher portion of the pig, they were eating the lower portion of the pig, the gut, called the chitterlings and the hog maws, and they were eating the feet. They were eating the low part of the pig, while the Europeans were eating up on the shoulder, the muscle meat, called eating high on the hog. Now, the whole idea of how to divide up the plantations comes from the urban cities of Africa. This etching may not be all that clear, but they truly try to copy that whole system in the St. Helenius Island of dividing up the land, trying to make highways using the coastal water lines and divisions of plantations based on how the cities and urban cities in Africa were. St. Helena's Island was called Santa Helena when it was first so-called discovered. Now, this business about discovery gets kind of tricky. Europeans discover something when it's important to them and has some significance. But Santa Helena was discovered by the Paleo-Indians long before the Europeans came. That's why they were here first, the Paleo-Indians. And later we had the Gullah Indians and the Kusaba Indians who inhabited this area here. But they left the area, and the area became inhabited by a group from out of the Creek civilization called the Yamasee. The Yamasee are an African Indian group. They are darker in complexion than the other Indians. The examination of Paleo-Indians fossil remains indicate that these Yamasee Indians are structurally totally different from them. The Yamasees came in contact with the Africans in 1800 BC and interbreeded and intermarried with the Africans, and so they are very more distinctive from the Paleo Indians, the Yamasee. In fact, yam is an African word. Yam is a sprout, a potato sprout, a sweet potato sort of sprout. It's not the sweet potatoes. The sweet potato is a root. The yam is a sprout. And our people didn't eat things that grew in the ground. They ate sprouts and fruit. But we have a problem here in America with the word fruit because the Supreme Court, in order to help a farmer not pay any fruit tax, changed tomato into a vegetable, which tomato is a fruit. So the distinction between a fruit and vegetable is done simply because of economics. Nonetheless, they copied this whole plantation system, dividing up the lands from out of Africa, Santa Helena Island, which extended from Edisto all the way down to Savannah. Now, this is how the cities were divided in Africa, as I mentioned before. And this is the plan of how they laid out the cities and the plantation system based on how the urban cities in Africa were laid out. Now, as you saw on the coast of Africa, there was Yoruba people. And a lot of Yoruba cooking was brought to this area. And this is Yoruba cookery book, the Kandita book of Yoruba cooking. And it shows how this is the mortar and pestle, which is an African instrument brought to America by the Africans. And here's the Llaila hair wrap and the cornrow hair design. Nonetheless, these things were brought to the Sea Islands, and they're called Gullah cooking or Geechee cooking today. Now, when I mentioned that the coastline of Africa closely resembles the coastline of North America, it's because of the Gondwanaland, which is called World Island. The Africans call it Gondwanaland, when all of these lands were connected as one. North America and South America, Africa, India, China, Europa. Europa is the name given to Europe by a black African queen named Europa. She named this continent, by the way. So all of these lands were connected together. And then we get into the continental drift, when they started drifting apart. The land began to crack along seams, and Africa began to separate out. This is almost the true size of Africa, which is larger than it shows on the traditional maps that you see. And the continents began to drift apart. But you can see the coastline of Africa closely resembles the coastline of South America and North America. The Portuguese did slave trade to South America. The British eventually controlled North America. And Spain went into the Bahamas and Puerto Rico and other areas like that. And on this map you have the true name of Africa. Africa comes from an Egyptian word, as I mentioned before, Akibulan. That is what the Africans called Africa. Just as the Sea Islands was called Chikoria by the Native American Indians. The continental drift. Now that I'm back to this urban heritage of West Africa, I'm back to it once again to distinguish for you that the technology, the land relationship, because of the continental drift, made this area quite similar in North America or South America to the coast of Africa. If you want to build a civilization like the Europeans wanted to do, you have to go to civilization builders, people that know how to make civilization work. And that's why they came here to Africa, for that technology, that people that knew how to build, knew how to teach, knew how to make irrigation, knew how to cultivate. One of the first books on cultivation is called The Domestication of Plants by Jack Corlin. It explains how the Africans knew how to domesticate plants, which you call farming and cultivation. Now these are the slave routes which I mentioned to you earlier. Down here is Portugal, Brazil. The Portuguese language is spoken there because the Portuguese took on South America. They fought over these slave routes and these passages, but they're all coming out of this area here, coast. You see Liberia again, the Ivory Coast, Ghana, Togo, Benin, Nigeria, Cameroon, Gabon, Congo, Angola, Zaire. You see all this, not Zaire, Zaire, excuse me. Zaire is a city that was controlled by another lady I'll bring up later on as we talk. So they exploited this area and brought the captivated, enslaved prisoners of war called slaves over to South America and North America. But they didn't do this in a friendly way. They were fighting each other all along to control various parts of the slave business. In fact, the Portuguese would often attack the French slave ships and sink them at sea. And the French would often attack the Spanish because they were in business and they were trying to create a scarcity market. Let me get this clear for you. Again, you have the exploration routes. This is the route that Columbus took. This is the Canary Islands going this way. The various routes that Cockhair took this route to Newfoundland. John Cabot took this route. But they call themselves explorers. But history calls them invaders. They invaded the area along the coast again, because the idea was to establish outposts, then burn the food crops of the natives, kill the leaders, and this would cause them to fragmentate. They did the same technique in Africa. They burned the land, the food crops, they killed the leaders, caused fragmentation, and then they captured the coast, what they call rape, pillage, and burn. Then they would come in and rape the men and rape the women. A woman was any little girl that may have the beginnings of a breast or a full breast. That's any girl from 9 and older they would rape. So they raped the men and they raped the women. And this would cause fragmentation. But because the Europeans were so small in number, they had to use a tactic known as terrorist tactics. A terrorist tactic is something used simply to scare a person. So for instance, when they caught a man who had ran away, an African man who had run away, they may cut off his feet or his hand in full view of the other Africans. They go into the main center of the plantation, cut off the feet or the hands, and eat the feet and the hands. You have to read a book called Civilization of Europeans, written by Europeans, about the cannibalism of the Europeans. The last recorded act of cannibalism occurred in the Sea Islands, of course, and then there was the other act that occurred in 1946 in Germany. But of course, the Sea Islands, Jean Ribault, one of the famous European discoverers of this area, his group performed cannibalism right here in the Sea Island area in South Carolina. But nonetheless, they would use these terrorist tactics by catching a slave to run away and cutting off his hand and eating his hand in full view of the other slaves. Or a slave that decided to marry another slave according to African ceremony and have a child, they would hang the woman and cut out the child in the woman's belly and eat the child in front of the full view of the other slaves in order to terrorize them and keep them in bondage psychologically. Nonetheless, these terrorist tactics were used to control these routes. They divided up these various trade routes. The Portuguese had some, Spanish, French, British, and they fought over the bead trade because bead was a currency of exchange. You have to understand that the silver coins of the Europeans meant nothing to the American Indians and nothing to the Africans. They were considered buttons without holes in them. So their money meant nothing. It had no functional use. The European kind of culture uses a lot of dirt. They use gold and silver, whereas in African cultures and those cultures that are high evolved, civilizations that are high evolved, they use things that have a function, a purpose. They use a chair, they use beads, they have things that have a function. But a coin has no function other than to represent some value. You don't use it for anything else. But the things that the Africans used for money was something that you could use, had a function. So everything in Africa had a function. It wasn't just something to look at. Nonetheless, that's why the bead trade route was very important and why they fought over it. The Europeans did. This is the coast I was referring to, the coast of Georgia, where the Sea Islands are in the Atlantic Ocean, St. Simon's Island, down the lower part of Georgia, Sao Paulo, you're going all the way up the coast. All of these are the islands that sit in the Atlantic Ocean. Going all the way up. Now, what we have here is a so-called runaway slave. Run away. Runaway or Cameroon. It's another word for it. And this man is not running away, he's liberating himself for his freedom. There were many runaway slaves and communities established by runaway. Georgia, South Carolina, Tennessee, Mississippi. There were communities of free blacks or runaway blacks who established these communities, and they were self-sufficient. They had their own farms, they made their own clothing, they traded amongst each other. But this caused a lot of problems to their slave owners. They wanted these communities destroyed. A lot of these men and women were capoeiros, which is the original form of what you call today karate. And they were called people that could fly. They were capoeiros, and they practiced a high form of so-called karate, which is called capoeira, which comes from Africa, as well as acupuncture. All of these sciences come out of Africa, and they were called the people who could fly. And the slave masters did not want the other slaves to be in contact with these free communities. These free communities would attack the slave plantations, destroy crops, and liberate their brothers and sisters. And a man by the name of General Andrew Jackson in 1812, the War of 1812, used that as an excuse to attack these free communities. He attacked them in 1812, he attacked again in 1816, and then again in 1818. Finally, in 1835, the American government at that time said that the Indians and Seminole Negro War was becoming too costly for them. So they had to devise a way to get rid of these free blacks who were running away for their freedom and joining with other blacks. So General George Jessup in 1842 of the American Defense Department declared the Negro War. It was unofficially declared the Negro War, as the Negroes were not viewed as a man, so they couldn't call it a Negro War. That's why it was unofficial. But it was actually a war declared by the United States Department of War by General Jessup in 1842. And that war led to the formation of the so-called Marines and the Texas Rangers, who helped to keep the runaways from leaving South Carolina. Nonetheless, they attacked these runaway communities and destroyed them, and take many of them at gunpoint to a state called Oklahoma. In fact, today you will find a Seminole County in Oklahoma, and Brackenville in Texas is another county where the Cameroons or Free Gullahs had run away in attempts to escape the onslaught of General George Jessup in the United States Army at that time. That's called the Negro War. Now, this is some of the technology that the Africans, our ancestors, brought to America. This is a sluice gate or trunk used for the irrigation and drainage of the rice fields. These gates would open, sort of like used in the Panama Canals, copy the same technology that comes out of Africa. They made sluices for the ships to go through to one side to the other. Sluice system. This is a technology brought to the Sea Islands by the so-called slaves, who were actually prisoners of war. The Africans fought the Europeans for well over 500 years, their onslaught. They resisted the Muslimization of their country for 200 years. They resisted the Christianization of their country for 400 years. I don't want to get into some misunderstanding. What I'm trying to say is that there's a book put together by Europeans at the Council of Nice called the Bible. They put together this book. They admit they put it together. That's the European version of an African religion, which is called Christianity. And then there's a European version of an African religion, which is called Muslim, or Islamic religion. And these Europeans put together these books to control black people, African people. Because in Africa there were many religious concepts, but no religion was divided from another. Any religion that divides you from your brother is a European religion. Any religion that causes you to unify with your brother is an African religion. The concept of division and separating and fragmentation and scarcity is a European concept coming out of that cold climate, coming where there was a scarcity of food, a scarcity of supplies, coming out of the disease climate. You have to understand that the Europeans started off with plagues, bubonic plague, which would affect, like if you had 100,000 people, of the 100,000 people that were affected by the bubonic plague, at least 800,000 would die. 800 would die, excuse me. So you have 100,000 people, 90% of them would die from the bubonic plague. That's what I'm saying. So they had bubonic plagues in 68 AD, 77 AD, 90 AD, and they come out of a scarcity of population, a scarcity of food, so they have what they call violence. And you find this violence indicative of Europeans' constructed religions and how they Europeanized an African religion called Christianity and made a Bible which has a lot of violence in it, smiting, killing, and has a lot of insulting things about women in it. This is indicative of European culture, and you find the same thing occurs in the Quran, where they separate and have the woman this place in back of the man, puts her in a lower position, and there's a lot of violence in that book also, attacking and warring. This is European structure of an African religion. And that's what most groups in the African American communities in America argue about. They argue about one white man's Bible, the Bible and another white man's Bible, the Quran, and how they were distorted by a European group of people. But nonetheless, what I'm trying to say is anything that separates you from your brother has to be looked at closely. And usually it comes from a European perspective. The sluice system, the phosphate era in cotton. Now the first deep sea divers in America were the Gullahs. They dove off the Wando River, which is south of the Broad River, in a fossilized stream. They dove for phosphate. Phosphates were used for fertilizer on farms. It's also one of the foundations of a soda called colas, Coca-Cola, Pepsi-Cola. Those are phosphates, and they were called phosphates when they were first introduced into America. They stripped the body of minerals, calcium and magnesium and zinc and all those other trace minerals, and that drink was called phosphate at the time, and they would ask for a phosphate when they went to the store. Nonetheless, the first deep sea divers in America were African men, and they dove for this substance called phosphate, which was used for fertilization and also used for the glaze on the metal pots that were used on that time. These are the black militia. I don't think that's very clear. These were the Negro soldiers, 70,000 of them. They were put in charge of white people, seized certain areas under the federal law, and they were lynched in uniform, many of them, by whites. During a period of time in the 18th century, they deposited over $50,000 in the bank, and it was all taken away from them. This is an example of some of the African traditions and cultures that were indicative of African culture that was brought over, this carrying a basket on the head. And they had a certain way of wrapping so-called apron around the waist, which shows what group they came from. This is a basket on the head. This is a bucket on the head. Men and women carry things on the head because it's in the center of your body, and it helps you from losing your weight, keeps you centered. And this is one of the things, technologies that the Africans, our ancestors, brought here, as well as finding wells. Let's see. Now, we have here a man weighing cotton, but each woman in this line here is responsible for picking 3 acres of cotton a day, and 3 acres of rice a day. Rice farming was harder than cotton farming. Rice farming, you had to clear the land. Then you had to plant the rice by hand. Then you had to stand in at least 2 feet of mud with mosquitoes and snakes for 10 hours a day to do this rice farming. It was the most grueling form of farm work there is done, rice farming. There is wetland rice and there's dryland rice, which does not require that much water, but the crop that produces faster is the one that's in the marsh area. This is the Penn Center. Was a school on St. Helena's Island on Land's End Road, Penn Center. The school was established by 2 ladies. Towns, I believe, was one of the names, but the main thing I want to address is that the school was established for the domestication of the Negro. It was an educational experiment. This man, William Penn, his father, Sir Penn, used to be a treasurer, and he used to steal money or accidentally had to collect taxes twice, let me put it that way. He would collect taxes, and then he'd say, well, something happened and all the money burnt, and then I'll have to collect the taxes again. So he collected taxes twice. He eventually lost his job as treasurer. Nonetheless, he was involved in seeing that the proper taxes were collected for slaves, the proper taxes, and he recorded rapes of blacks and the slave tax and all in his diary, and this had nothing to do about his religious mentality or his son's religious mentality. Because in 1661, Mr. Penn, before they invaded Malabar in the East Indies, had his slave Jack dance with Sir Baton's slave, Mandingo, as they were drunk and had the 2 men dance. This is part of the mentality of Mr. Penn. And he also had the pews separated in the church so he didn't have to sit with the lower class whites, and least of all sit with the 3/10 or 3/5 of a man known as a Negro. So he was not concerned about the blacks, the African Americans at all. He was concerned about money. Him and his father thought they were illegally cheated out of their wealth. So they had to find a way to accumulate some more money. And they got on this idea as the other Dutch that came from New York and other areas up north to get some money out of the Sea Island area. All they had to do was control the African Americans. If they control the African Americans, then they control the land. If they control the land, then they control the money. And And they decided to use this educational experiment known as the domestication of Negro in an attempt to re-establish the wealth which they were cheated out, in their mind, from their motherland. This is an example of the interior of a slave pen. This is Price and Birch Slave Company in Charleston. They would buy the slaves and put them in these pens, holding pens, until the sale. Usually the slave ship would dock in Charleston, stay there for about 3 days, and wouldn't unload the cargo of slaves. They would stay there, and they would sell maybe 3 slaves one day, 100 slaves the next day, in order to cheat the local merchants out as much money as they could before they unloaded their whole cargo of slaves. And they would put them in these holding pens, which looked like jails, which is actually what they were, until it was time for their sale. And they had pick up and deliver, of course. Just like you pick up and deliver pizzas, that's what they did with African Americans at that time. The wealthy would have their slaves brought directly to their house, and they would not go to the public auction in the center of the city. The auction was held usually in their backyard or in their front, and the slaves were brought directly to them. Pick up and delivery kind of thing of slaves. Now, this ship, I'm showing you a picture of this ship, not because of the book that says South Carolina and the sea, but because of the technology again. In the 15th century in Ceuta, Sir Henry found out how to make sails. He studied the Egyptian sail making technique in Lagos and other areas, and finally found out how to make a caraboose, which is a slave ship. The ships before them, they used to use flat sails, the Europeans, and they were just too bulky to get in close to get to the slave cargo, and they were too slow. Or they used the smaller ships, they would get in close to the land to pick up the slaves, but they couldn't carry enough. And when he learned about this technique of how to make sails from the Egyptians, from the Africans, then the slave business was fully in gear. Then he was able to transport at least 390 slaves on these boats as small cargo of slaves, the caraboose. And this is the inside of the slave ship. How they packed the slaves in rows like this, bringing them to the sea island areas. The technology is what they were after. They didn't expect all of these slaves to live. At least 3/4, if they would live, they were fine with that. Because with the Europeans, aside from their violence, came disease. At least 3/4 of Africa population was destroyed by extermination, by the Europeans, by wars, by the tribal wars, by the slave trade, and by diseases. The American Indians, for example, just to give you the impact of European disease on the people, at least 90% of the Eskimos were killed by smallpox. 3/4 of the American Indian population was killed by smallpox. You have at least, conservative estimation, 500 million Africans were killed in the slave trade. That's 500 million people destroyed by the Europeans in less than 300 years. The European population in Europe on the coastal area was estimated to be 150 million. 60 million of them died due to their own diseases. The disease route of the European was very impacting. As they moved along the Rhine and the Gaul, traveling along, 10,000 people would die a day from the diseases in which the Europeans carried. And then they reversed, going back the route, 10,000 people would die as they reversed. But the only reason why these pandemics and plagues stopped is because they ran out of people to kill, to murder, these diseases which we think nothing of, smallpox, syphilis, gonorrhea, and these diseases the Europeans had. But in Africa, there was an unlimited supply of people. So a lot of the slaves died from the contact of the Europeans alone, the diseases which they forcefully raped the women and men, caused them to be diseased. And they were stacked in these slave ships, as you can see, in layers and decks. 1, 2, 3, 4 decks of slaves just laying down like this, and at least a ½ inch of feces, urine, and bowel movement on the trip over, taking 6 months or less. This is a slave ship, and the hair was no longer combed, so it was matted on the head, and sores would develop, and flies would be around the head, and the chains would cause the flesh to rip and tear, and scab would grow, and then the chain would rub against it and rip it and tear it again, so maggots and flies are all around the wounds, around the neck, around the wrists, around the ankles, and the gnats and flies around the head because of the sores. And they sustained this kind of living environment to show the strength that they had, and that's why we're here today. You have to understand, for each one of us alive, 10 have died. And that's the responsibility that the African Americans have, to use the past of our ancestors to take us to a new future beyond which we are now. We have to go back and recapture that mentality of our ancestors. Nonetheless, this is a slave ship. And Negroes, or those blacks from the Niger River, was especially from the Wagonwood or Rice Coast, sold at a higher price. And this is a petition or bill of a slave auction, showing that they have not been inflicted with smallpox, as I mentioned before. They killed so much of the Indian population, the Antarctica Eskimos. 90% of them died from smallpox, and they would use smallpox blankets to defeat the American Indians. They would have this disease blankets they had from the smallpox victims and give them to the American Indians during the winter as a gift, and kill 90% of the population. So they're showing that they were free of smallpox in this bill. And they came from Banks Island, which was a slave island outside of the coast of Sierra Leone, which was controlled by the English, or British as they call themselves, which is a fragmented group. I don't know how clear this is showing up, but these are the cabins, actual slave cabins that existed here in 1861. These are how they look. And when you lived in a slave cabin, you were about 100 yards from the sea. They would put the cabins between the sea and the field, so you could not run to the water. You had to run toward the slave master's house, so therefore you could not escape. So at night, the tide would come in and soak this area, and so the floors were damp and musky. The children slept on the floor, and the adults slept on a bench. And each one of these small 10 by 10 houses, at the largest 10 by 16, would hold 2 families. The adults slept on the bench, and usually they'd throw some rags on the floor, and the children slept on the floor. These musky, damp cabins. Stop it. It's an issue about foods and the Bible, which is an African book. As I mentioned before, it was kind of changed and distorted by the Europeans because they put together their version of the Bible, the official King James version of the Bible. But I want to give you a little more background on what I was talking about in reference to this book. Now, when I was mentioning the fragmentation and isolation of communities that were related by blood, which you call a tribe, and these similarities of what you call tribalism occurs in the black church itself. This is a tribalism that's brought over here by our African ancestors. That's why you have so many divisions within certain religious groups, Methodists and Baptists, because of the tribalism. The preacher is supposed to represent the congregation, and when the congregation feels that the preacher no longer represents their group, that group moves away from the church and forms another church, different from the church they left. So that's a form of tribalism. And any religion that divides African Americans or black people is usually European based. And so this form of tribalism, this division, is what I'm talking about. This is not an African concept in worship. In African worship, you have everything in pairs. Everything. The sky is in pairs. The sky and the clouds, that's 2. At night, it's the dark sky and the stars, that's 2. And in religion, you have the mother and father God, that's 2. Everything is in pairs, and they call it the female and male principle. It's not a worship of 2 or a separate God. It's the concept that the Africans, our ancestors, saw everything in pairs, man and woman. It's a natural way for things to be. But this business of separating and dividing off is part of the tribalism that caused Africa to decline. It's part of the things we're trying to move away from. But nonetheless, religions are useful in that the books give to you a clear reflection of how the people live. Let me go back to this slide one more time for you. It talks about the diet. The people in these religions, no matter what they were, the prophets, be the prophet Jesus or the prophet Muhammad, ate a natural diet, ate these type of foods. The manna was a natural food. And so they give you that kind of reflection of what happened in antiquity and before Africa was divided up. How the civilizations and groups migrated and went to one area, Europa, went to North and South America, went to Australia. But Australia actually was never part of Wonderland or World Island. It was always separated out like that, Australia. But it gives you an idea everything was in unity. And so the Africans saw everything in unity. Nothing was divided and separated, which is linear thought by definition. As I mentioned before, all this technology was brought to America, how to combine food. This recipe, this spice recipe, this indicative of this Kentucky Fried Chicken, as you know, a white man, especially a plantation owner, was not found in the kitchen cooking chicken. This whole spice recipe is an African recipe. All these things were copied from African women, just as the music and the art was copied. The first chemists, the first herbalists were African women, the Gullah women. A lot of things were taken from Gullah people, such as this opera called Porgy and Bess, written by Gershwin. He studied the Gullah music on Charleston and other islands and composed that score based on Gullah people's music. And he called that his music and called the score his score and called it the opera Porgy and Bess. He wrote down that he got this sound from this area, from the Sea Island area. And also the technique of how to combine foods. These foods were not found in Europe. They were brought into Europe by the Africans, our ancestors, the peanuts, which is in the bean family. That is responsible for what they call today this soybean industry. The research that George Washington Carver did on the peanut, which is a bean, was also duplicated on the soybean. And so they have a whole vast variety of soy products made out of soy ice, and soy meat, and soy burgers, and soy steak. This whole health food industry that people are talking about is based on the research done by George Washington Carver on a bean called the peanut. You have the nuts and seeds, which was a particular section of food on the African's plate. And all these tropical fruits, the pomegranate, all these plants come from Africa itself, and the techniques of combining them come from Africa. This is a mortar and pestle, and again, she's grinding up some seeds. You have all these seeds that our ancestors knew how to work with. Corn is a seed. It's the fruit of the corn plant, so corn is a fruit. And then you have millet, which is also a seed. And then you have the sesame seed, which is of course a seed. And then you have wheat, which is another seed. Then you have rice, which is another seed. And all of these were seeds, and so the seeds were called, named after a Greek god. The Greeks stole this whole combining thing of seeds from the Africans and called them wheat and cereal and giving them all these names so you won't know that they are seeds. And this technique of seed grinding and seed purification and stripping the hulls off comes from out of Africa. A Llaila, again, the African garb for protecting the hair, because the head is where you lose a lot of your temperature and a lot of your moisture. So in hot countries, the head is always covered. The music, of course, the Mandingo, particularly known for their work with string instruments, and the Yoruba are known for their work with drums. But the drum was outlawed in 1860, not 1860, excuse me, the drum was outlawed in 1560. It was outlawed again in 1720. The drum has always been outlawed. The language of the drum is known as this thing you call a telegram. That whole language of telegrams was taken from the African drum system of language. And so they outlawed the drum because they found out that the Africans talked with the drum. And they called them talking drums. It takes at least between 30 or less days to communicate a message across the continent of Africa. Less time. By drum. Less than 30 days. Across the entire continent of Africa. Now, as I mentioned before, a lot of the things that we somewhat don't like come out of Africa, like the Kingdom of Kong, which we think is related to some gorilla, which is a vast empire and large cities. As I mentioned before, these walled cities on the coast of Africa, the streets were paved. You had the southern savannah area, Ghana, Togo, Nigeria. The empires of the Mossi, the Mandingo, the Empire of Kong, which is the Ivory Coast. You had the forest belt cities and empires of Sante, Benin, Dahomey. In 1633, you had Kumasi, which was the capital of the forest belt region. And the architecture that came out of these areas. Remember, I mentioned these cities were walled, had 127 wards in them. Some of the walls were 100 miles long, and so when the Europeans approached them, they thought it was one building. You have walls that extended for 100 miles. And these were floodplains where all these cities were, as I mentioned before. Each ward has a different ethnic group, like the Fulani or Guinea, and had different cultures and ceremonies. And they were ruled by elders, which you call mayors today. All of this concept of government, of bureaucracy, comes out of Africa. And they have books on it called the Bantu bureaucracy, which explains how bureaucracy was laid out. In these African cities, you had Hausa land, which had a 100-mile wall, which is Queen Amina was in charge of Zaire there. And you had the Borno Empire, the capital was Kukwawa, which had 2 walled cities and wars. The east section was for the wealthy, and the west section was for the workers and guild workers. And you had Nigeria, the city of Kano, We had 14-mile walls in the Asante Empire, and the Niger Bend towns of Janneh and Mopti and Sarfara and Gondama and Timbuktu. West Africa itself was the size of the United States, which is 2.5 million miles square miles, I mean. Now let me talk a little bit about this religious group here. This is the Spanish Negroes, as they are called. The old tradition remains there. They still wear these garbs in Spain. This is a black church in Nuestra Senora de los Angeles in Barrio Carmel. They still maintain this area for their priests. It's in Seville, Spain. These are called the Zungayas Anilis das Sevilas. This is Madrid, Spain, where they had their annual parade. This picture is about, they started this in about 1677 in European recorded history. And they wear this hood and they wear these white sheets, which you today associated with the Ku Klux Klan, but it's actually an African group, an African religion. In Seville, Spain, today. And a lot of the things that were fought about, such as the spices that were used to save the Europeans from infection and diseases, are called spices today. Nutmeg was fought over. Clove was fought over. But in the records, the ancient records of the so-called explorers, which are called invaders, they list them as medicaments because they were used for medicinal purposes, but today we call them spices. This is shoemaking. This was taught at Penn Center, where they were using an experiment called the educational experiment in how to domesticate the Negro and make them more service-orientated. Shoemaking, of course, was done in Africa. This is a technology brought over here from Africa. Again, this is the walled cities. These were huge areas. I mentioned the wards. These are large walls. These are not small walls. These walls are 40, 50 feet high. And they were built to explain the laws of nature, the laws of God, the laws of man. They replicated the pineal gland and the ventricles of the brain, where the soul supposedly resides, and the hierarchy of the spirit, which is called the municipalities. This is cypress farming, which is another technique brought over from West Africa. Basket weaving and how to grow cypress and grass and sweet grass and all those things used here in the Sea Island area is a technology from out of Africa. Sweetgrass farming, marsh farming. Again, the grinding of seeds, the various seeds, and you can see this woven basket there. Let me point that out to you. Over on the side here where they sift the seeds. Again, the herdsmen, the horsemen, and the donkeys, and all this sort of domesticating of animals comes out of Africa. The wheel was invented in Africa, and the hoe, and the levers, and the pulleys. All of these are sciences that come out of Africa that the African people brought to the Sea Island area. Majority of the highways in America and the Sea Islands were built by black men. This is a black working team in the Bull Swamp, working on the Bull Swamp Road in Orange County, Orangeburg County in South Carolina. The major highways were built by African people. And of course the system of how to build buildings, the majority of the churches and religious structures were built by African people, and they always left in the left-hand corner of the building a key to identify where they came from. As I mentioned before, the Europeans would control certain portions of the coastline. This is cotton farming, which gave some people yaya, crop yards, which is infections of the hands. But nonetheless, they had to work them anyway, and each woman there is responsible for 3 acres of farming, as I mentioned before. They estimated that a slave would live for 7 years and then drop dead from exhaustion. So they didn't expect slavery to last as long as it did. They expected most of the slaves to die, but there was a lot of strength in our African ancestors that caused them to be able to survive. But they entered Africa on its decline. In 1648, the Dutch helped Queen Nzinga defeat the Portuguese. The Dutch and the Portuguese were fragmented European tribes, and each one was pulling for power. And the Portuguese were controlling the coast, and so the Dutch, realizing how strong Queen Nzinga was, helped her to defeat the Portuguese. There were some black states on the coast that were never affected by slavery, never invaded by the Europeans, and stayed strong and free all through the European invasion, such as Congo and Ngonga. They were states that stayed free all along, and the Dembo people defeated the Portuguese and stopped slavery. Just as I mentioned, Toussaint Louverture, he defeated every European army in the world during the 18th century. The Gullah or Kisi or Creole, or those ethnic groups which identify this area, defeated the Marines, as well as the Texas Rangers, as well as the black pirates that had ships in the coast that attacked slave ships and freed their brothers and sisters, as well as the independent communities in Alabama, South Carolina, and Georgia that were free and staged revolts, invaded, and then had invasions on the plantations and freed their brothers and sisters and burned crops. There are many instances where black people have overcome slavery and pointed a way to freedom for those who could not be free. This is another technology brought to the area by the Gullah people. Now, most of the time, the Gullahs are associated with their use of the language, which is a West African language with English words incorporated in it. So we only think of the labor, which is the way the Europeans tell his story. We think of the Africans coming over here for labor, and they spoke funny, had a Negro dialect. But they actually spoke African languages. Many of them spoke more than 5 or 6 different languages and were college graduates. And they were coming to a low level of technology when they came here. They had to step down what they do quite a few degrees to come to the European level of what they wanted. So this man is constructing a tabby wall. It's constructed in tiers, and these pins here, this pin, and this pin, and this pin, were removed once this wall was dried out, and then they built this wall. Then he would construct this wood above the dry portion, just as he did here, and put the pins in and wait for this portion to dry, and then pull out the pins and stack and stack and stack until he had the wall. It's mixed in lime with sand and with seashells. Called a tabby wall, which is an African word. Tabby is an African word. Yam is the African word. Goober is an African word. And the nicknames or basket names were given these men were indicative of their ancestors or some characteristic that's associated with their uncles or fathers or their aunts. Some characteristics, so they named them for that. This man here, say for instance, he was one who drank a lot of milk when he was breastfed. He was associated with the top of the woman's dress, which is called Bubba. So that his nickname may be Bubba, because he drank a lot of milk when he was being breastfed. And Bibi is another African nickname, which is called Kabibi. It was a city in Africa. Now again, we have indigo farming in this picture. Indigo extraction. This is the press here. And this is the indigo. They're taking indigo, and all this is a step-by-step how to extract the dye indigo from the plant. Now, indigo or black dye was very expensive. It was a very expensive color, black, in America, indigo. And indigo farming was taught to Mrs. Pinckney by Africans. She wrote that down. She was taught indigo dye extraction by Africans. She wrote that, Mrs. Pinckney, Elizabeth Pinckney of South Carolina. This is that technique of how to extract the indigo. As I mentioned before, the Europeans didn't have that many colors in their civilization. They had brown and mostly gray, which is the color of the hides and furs of the animals they wore. And these colorful garments come from Africa, the yellow, the orange, the green, the blue. And the indigo farming and how to extract this dye was a chemistry that comes out of the universities in Africa, in the urban cities. Now this house is built in that pyramidal shape. The pyramid was quite an important shape in Africa. As you can see, we call it the slanting roof, but this is a pyramid shape. Whenever you see a pyramid and you see it on the dollar, it comes from Africa. Pyramids are African technology. Our ancient African ancestors who came to America before Columbus taught pyramid building to the Mexicans. Step pyramid building. And this shape here of the roof is part of that pyramid function. It holds a lot of energy, force, and it has a lot of other significant meanings. This man here is sitting weaving a basket. I talked about how important the tribal bead was in the exchange for money, and how important controlling the bead route was, which was fought over in Africa. Beads. Everything was functional in African civilization. Things were not just done because they looked good. Cities were not made out of walls because they looked good. They had a functional reason, educational reason. But as I said before, the shift of the fragmentation of the groups in Africa, the tribes, caused Africa to decline in power. There were people to unify the fragmented tribal groups and communities, such as Queen Hatshepsut in 1623. There was to 1663. There was Queen Nzinga. Queen Hatshepsut did the same thing. And then again in Mututu in 1440, he united the coastal states of Zambia all the way up to Mozambique. And then in 1641, the Dutch came in and reduced Portugal's control of the coast by joining forces with Queen Nzinga, as I mentioned before. But a lot of the things, such as dancing, had a lot of significant meanings. It wasn't, dances were not just done because they looked good. It was part of the evolution of your spirit, as well as your mind, as well as your body. So certain dances were not performed by children below 7 or below 9. Some dances were only performed by adults. It wasn't done because they looked good. It was done for higher reasons than that. This is the ring shout, which is a lifestyle, a custom brought over by African people by the Gullah people. The ring shout. It was done with secular music, as they call it. The music was played at funerals, the music was played at weddings, the music was performed at birth. And so the Europeans, not understanding this, called them spirituals, or Negro music, Negro spirituals as they called it. But the ring shout was done, the people would randomly walk around. Randomly walk until they formed a circle. And because the drum was outlawed, the rhythm was carried in the feet as they stepped a certain way, and what they called later in the 50s and 60s hand jive, which they would pat their thighs or clap their hands to have the other rhythms. So they would carry the rhythms with their feet, with their hands, and with their heads. They would move their heads to mimic certain birds. It's done today in Sudan. But nonetheless, this ring shout is a religious dance. As I remember talking to you earlier, if you remember, I was telling you how significant the circle was in power and force. So they would move around until they got into a trance. The trance state is indicative of all thinking done by African people. Trances. That's when your mind is part in your body and part outside of your body. And they call it a trance state, where you pull on your spiritual mind as well as the physical mind. They call it a trance. The Europeans break that down and call it hypnosis and the things of that sort. But your higher thinking was always done in trance. So they would move around, and the rhythm would pick up and pick up and pick up until it became into a fast frenzy state, until the trance was felt by the whole group. And sometimes the slave owners would not like these trance states, and they would not allow them to have these ring shouts, but they weren't able to stop them. They would sometimes burn some palm leaves from the plants and form a fire and do them at night. So they would devote one house, usually the largest house on the plantation, slave plantation, for religious ceremonies. But the Europeans, telling his story, would tell you that they were trying to civilize the Africans and teach them religion, but the Africans already had religion. They had over 10,000 years of religion in Africa. So they were not teaching them religion. They were Europeanizing them. They were domesticating. They were slaving them. They were disenfranchising them from Africa. This is rice cultivation, as it was done in the Sea Island area, which rice cultivation was also done in Africa, and that's why they got the Africans from the coast and brought them here to perform something they had 10,000 years of experience as a people in doing, rice cultivation. You must realize that the so-called laws, which they said the northern Yankees or Europeans up north said they did to free the slaves, did not free the slaves at all. The Slave Trade Act in 1808 stopped the importation of slaves. Also, the British stopped slavery in 1838 in the Bahamas, but the Bahama plantation owners brought the slaves to the Sea Islands. So they really didn't stop slavery. Stopping slavery is almost related to having a traffic light but no electricity running to the light. So it was no power, it was no army, it was no group to enforce the stopping of slavery. It was just words, as well as the Emancipation Proclamation, just words. No one was enforcing this. Lincoln himself said you could retain slaves. It was just words. The 13th Amendment, which was passed 8 months after Lincoln's death, was just words. No one was enforcing the freedom of slavery, the freedom of the slaves. No army, no police, no one. They were just words. But many of the black fairy tales, or African fairy tales, were taken by such people as Davy Crockett and such people as Walt Disney, took the Asante Spada stories and Warner Brothers with their Bugs Bunny. They took the Asante Spada stories, which is about a witty spider who was able to outwit the forces of evil by using his God force or his Godhead. And these stories, such as the Bugs Bunny and the Mickey Mouse and all these little rodents that the Europeans used, are taken from black fairy tales, which are not fairy tales. These are stories of how they evolved from one state of consciousness to another, called the rite of passage. I'm trying to reinforce this point that we were educated people. We came from an area of colleges and schools, a highly technically involved area with big cities, walled cities. They reflect our spiritual growth, our physical growth, and our psychological growth. Huge buildings, temples, pyramid tops, as I showed you before with the buildings. This is where we came from. We didn't come from nothing and no culture, no background. We had a technology with yams, rice, and there were ceremonies that involved them, which we taught to the Japanese and the Chinese. The yam ceremonies and the rice ceremonies. What we try to do is overview a lot of history here, about 10,000 years of African history, European history, and some of the American Indians' history. Trying to give a reflection of how these people got together and what was the reason. We understand that the Europeans were coming out of a cold climate, a climate as we would call it, where there's a lot of ripping off, a lot of violence, a lot of murder. That's why they have a form of medicine called allopathic medicine, which is generally used by those cultures that do a lot of fighting, involving a lot of war. A lot of the symbolism of their culture, the European culture, his story, is associated with violence, such as saluting, which is you raise your shield so you can see your enemy, or shaking hands to make sure your enemy doesn't have a weapon. All these things come out of violence, but we don't think that much of them today. So we have to kind of look at history, not within a his story or European perspective, but in a human perspective, to see what really happened when these people got together. Europeans were coming out of that cold climate. They were after wealth, they were after food, they were after a way to survive because their population was dying from diseases, and they were dying from lack of the science to save themselves, such as good medicine and good food. So they were looking for a way out, and Africa was that way out. And they used the thing which they knew best, which was divide and to conquer, separate, fragmentate, because that's all they were doing in their scarcity environment. That's why they use the scarcity economics today in handling their money and their money rituals. But we want to look at history more holistically, more from a human perspective. That's why we're looking at Gullah history, because it's distinct. It's distinct because it's very Afrocentric. The Africans from the West Coast came over to the Sea Islands, the Gullah people, and they were isolated on the islands, separated from the other slaves. They didn't mix with other slaves, so they were able to concentrate in this area. Because of the isolation, they retained more of the African culture. That's why the Sea Islands are very unique. The blacks came here with St. Augustine, came to St. Augustine with Ponce de Leon in 1510, and they were first Afro-Americans who were born on St. Catherine Island in 1526. So African culture really originates in the Sea Islands. and the African-centric way of dealing with life, the selling system. Let me point out just a few of those things that are indicative of West African people. As part of our roots, part of our heritage, let me just point to that. This, our real roots, West African roots, embodied in the Gullah lifestyle and culture, such as the ring shout, as we saw how we randomly get into a trance state of half mind and half spirit to deal with God. The custom of putting a broom in your house, not a broom to sweep your floor, but a broom that you put on the wall. Some people use a whisk broom. This is West African because the broom was used to clean the courtyard, to clean the religious temples. So that is a way of whisking out the bad spirits. That's why you find brooms in many of the Gullah people's houses. You'll see the door that's painted blue. That's the highest spiritual involvement. The color royal blue is found in the pyramid. It means highest spirituality. So a lot of blue doors will be found in the Sea Islands. Also, funerals will stop before they enter into the cemetery to get permission from the ancestral spirits before they go in. That's why funeral processions slow up when they get to the gate of the funeral cemetery. And that's why you find a lot of mirrors that are turned around backwards in people's houses when someone dies. Or you'll find broken glass in the cemetery because that breaks the chain of bad luck so that someone else won't die in the chain. And you also find in the cemeteries in the Gullah region knives, forks, spoons, because of the custom of in Egyptian society preparing a last meal before the person goes on their journey to heaven. You also find a last meal that's sometimes put on the porch when someone dies. You will find that the graveyard may even have a tire in it from a car because the person, the man who died, may have liked cars, so someone may have put a tire in there. You'll always find communication with the spirit world in part of the Gullah heritage in some way or form, in the religion and social talk, the spirit world, and that something had came to them, or they saw their grandmother, or their father told them, or someone who is deceased is communicating to them. They always talk in form of spirit. And anyone who's not talking in form of spirit is not talking in their right mind. And that's where the term right mind comes from. Now, this melanin factor, which I pointed out before, is very important. The melanin factor is why we Africans were born here, because of that melanin which is produced by the pineal gland. It makes us very unique, very superior in our build. Our legs are large in proportion to our trunk. The cortex of our brain in relationship to the medulla is smaller. We have a lower cholesterol count. We're able to respond to electromagnetic charges quicker. We absorb more color. We hear better because we absorb more sound. Our skin protects us from ultraviolet light, which also converts the ultraviolet light to something usable. We also find a lot of tyrosine and tryptophan in the foods that we eat, those amino acids. We also have a wider separation between our eyes, which gives us a larger field of vision. We have a highly developed buttock muscles. We have many characteristics that make us uniquely different from all other races and somewhat puts us in a superior definition by all definitions because of the melanin factor. That's what makes us unique. Now, when we talk about Gullah culture, we talk about the brooms that you find, as I mentioned before. We talk about the glass and mirrors and spoons that's found in the cemetery. We talk about the spirit world. We also talk about the praise house, which was found in those walled cities, as I mentioned before. Each ward was controlled by an elder or a mayor, and we brought that same system over here to America, the elder system. And the praise house, which is found on every plantation, has an elder in charge, and that elder and the council of elders or his advisor or his court help settle problems within the community, be that problem in marriage, be that problem with money, be that problem with children. Because discipline of the children was a community issue. And that's why we didn't have the amount of juvenile delinquency that we have now. We've turned over that kind of discipline and raising our children to someone alien from us, to the police as they call it today. But the discipline of the children or extended family is an African concept, and that was brought over by the Gullah people. We, as African people, did not come over on slave ships addicted to crack, with AIDS, with homosexuality, with violence, with a high rate of murdering each other. These things were introduced to us as a form of suppression, as a way of controlling us, and a way of keeping us from being connected to our culture. But the Gullah, and specifically, has pointed out that cultural survival is the way to survive as a people. It keeps us intact, keeps us free from being exploited by alien culture, be that European, Chinese, or Japanese. So Gullah, in its true history, as we said before, keeps us away from his story and keeps us into a human story. And that's what we're about when we talk about Gullah history and heritage, to tell us and reinforce within us our true nature and our true responsibility as a people to keep our culture survive, because that is the frame of reference which we use to define what is right and wrong for us, what is moral and what is immoral. Our cultural frame of reference. We must always refer back to our culture, our Gullah culture, our West African culture. We must know that just as well as we know European history. We must know something about African history. That is the thing that sustains us, to give us our driving force. So in this brief overview of Gullah history and heritage and Gullah history and culture, I was trying to communicate to you the strength that has brought us this far, the strength of our ancestors, the strength of being Gullah, the strength of being Kisi, Creole, Fulani, the strength of our culture to use as our foundation. Our culture is built upon our family, and our family is built upon the unity of the man and the woman. That is the technology of Africa, the family. And that is what we need to solve and define our direction and keep us in the human story. And that's why Gullah means the people blessed by God.
Could not the street of straight. Oh Lord, because my God, He is a good God. He's a merciful God. He went on to serve man by the name of Ananias. He said, oh Ananias, Ananias said, here my Lord. He said, I want you to go in the street of straight, one house of Judah. I want you to lay a hand upon Saul of Tarsus, that he may receive his sight. I said, God, I said, he's all right. God is all right. Can't you say it's all right? I know it's all right. Yeah. You see, this morning, he woke me up and got me on my way. God is all right. My Jesus, he's all right tonight. After a while, they tell me Ananias was afraid of the man because he was a mean man. When I hear Jesus, they said, behold, he prayed on the way. Go and lay your hand upon him that he may receive your sight. And they tell me Ananias went on the Lord's journey. When he got into the house, they tell me, brother Saul, even Jesus Christ, that prepared to be on the way. Tell me to come and lay my hand on you, that you might receive your sight. And they tell me that Ananias prayed for the man. And when the prayer was over, they tell me prayer will change things. I said prayer will change things. They tell me Saul testified. It seemed like scales fell from my eye. You see, when you don't know Jesus, you're a blind man. So you see, but your spirits are blind. After a while, fine boy, they tell me Ananias took him on out and baptized him in the name of Jesus. They tell me Saul began to eat meat and get his body strengthened and boldly in the name of Jesus.